Welcome everyone to 60 Days Beyond the Hype, building a sustainable gift to gain culture. Thank you for taking the time to join us today. Why are we here today? So we notice from our work with clients that there's always a lot of conversation on and around International Women's Day, but then a big silence afterwards. And we wanted to address this silence and the underlying issues with this webinar because we are really passionate about making a sustainable change for women when we work with our clients. We will go straight to the introductions, but I just want to say that we want this to be more informal or conversational experience, which is why there is 3 of us sharing our different perspectives. And if you have any questions or contributions throughout the session, please do pop them in the chat. Just going to admit one more person. There we go. So, Hannah, you can go to the next slide. Thank you. So I'm Frenzy. I'm the founder and director of Cape Consulting, an independent HR consultancy. We mostly work with small to medium-sized organisations and help them with a lot of their hands-on HR topics like policies, systems, general compliance. But we also love working on projects around culture. Rachel, would you like to go next?
Hi everybody, hope you can hear me okay. I'm Rachel. Sounds very grand saying a multi-award winning. I don't think I can quite say that, it sticks in the mouth. I am a people and culture director formerly, worked in senior HR roles for the best part of 20 years. I'm now founder of a company called ChangeWave Consultancy, and the topics today are very close to my heart, anything to do with inclusion, but particularly around maternity, both from a personal perspective and also some of the work I've done previously to try and manage that process more effectively. Lovely to be here, thank you.
Hello everyone, my name is Hannah Short and I'm the Director of Coaching and founder of the Coaching Nest. I am a maternity coach and I focus on supporting women through one of the biggest transitions in their careers, which is returning to work after maternity leave. So while HR often focuses on systems and policies, I work much closer to the individual experience, looking at confidence, identity, performance, and how women actually navigate that return day to day. And what I see consistently is this, that there's often a big gap between what organisations intend to support and what women actually experience. So why this conversation matters today. So as we know, International Women's Day creates a real moment of visibility. It's inspiring, it's energizing, and it sends a really strong message, which is that you belong here. But if we're being honest, many women experience it exactly that. It's just unfortunately a moment. And what happens next is where things really start to shift. What I hear from women in coaching conversations is this: I felt really valued on the day, but then a few weeks later, nothing has actually changed. And that gap between the message and the reality is where, unfortunately, disengagement happens. And over time, that affects not only the retention and progression, but unfortunately also trust. Because really, women are not looking for just one day of recognition. They're looking for evidence that inclusion still matters, even when that spotlight starts to fade. And that's really what this conversation is about here today, how organisations move beyond awareness moments and create meaningful, lasting cultural change that women can genuinely feel in their day-to-day working lives.
So the problem with International Women's Day only actions, and Hannah has already touched on some of this, is that we believe that there are a number of them really, when there's only action around one day of the year. So from an HR lens, what we see are common organisational patterns like one-off events, panels, internal communications, and maybe social media posts to recognise the topic or the day. And that's all well intended, but it's not really embedded in an organisation's systems. And it's also not a sustainable way of approaching the issues for women, especially around maternity, within the system. And really, you run into several risks through this approach. You have employees who might grow cynical around the topic. There's like Hannah mentioned, a level of trust erosion because it isn't something that people feel supported with on an ongoing basis. And also they might develop fatigue around diversity, equity and inclusion. And the data signals that HR often sees, which makes this topic really important, is that women do drop off at mid-career, and in engagement surveys, for example, you do see gaps between genders or life stages, and it does make it clear that this topic needs addressing on an ongoing basis and not only on one day of the year. So making a sustainable and ongoing change is something an organisation should be interested in.
And if we look at this through a maternity lens, and specifically at the point of maternity transitions, we like to call them, this is, like Francie said, where the disconnect can become very real. So women come back from maternity leave having gone through a huge life change, not just practically, but psychologically. And yet often they're returning into the same expectations, the same performance measures, the same ways of working, but with very little space to actually adjust. And so what happens then is that they're holding two competing pressures, which is that I need to prove I'm still committed, but I also need to manage a completely new life outside of work. And really, without that right support, this can lead to overcompensating. Unfortunately, we see a lot of burnout, or sometimes actually we see women quietly stepping back from progression opportunities. So when we say celebration without infrastructure creates disconnection, maternity really here is one of the clearest examples of that.
So what does a sustainable give to gain culture really mean? Again, from an HR lens, it means structural giving. So focusing on systems and not just the sentiment on one day of the year. So for example, flexible working policies that are actually being used, not just sit there without anyone ever really looking at them. Looking at manager capability and consistency, because just because you're a manager doesn't mean you automatically know everything. Career progression, transparency and return to work pathways, which are not ad hoc arrangements, but rather used consistently, and everyone knows what the next steps are and how to get there. And also that performance is measured on outcomes and not just on visibility, physical visibility in the office or in meetings, because again, that is what flexibility might look like for some, and they are most likely still delivering, even though they might not physically be visible.
Absolutely. And so from a maternity coaching perspective, what does giving look like beyond the kind of policies and the flexibility on paper? It's what we really call the kind of human giving. So the support that recognises the transition that women are going through. And that includes, recognising that returning to work is not just a logistical shift, it's also a real identity shift. Supporting women to rebuild their confidence and not just assuming that it's really there. And like as Francie said, creating space for those honest conversations about capacity, priorities and goals, and not just ad hoc conversations. And also helping women to really articulate their value instead of feeling like they need to apologise for flexibility. Because when that support is in place, what we see is such a real shift. Women don't step back, they actually step forward with more clarity, stronger boundaries, and a clearer sense of how they contribute. And that's where organisations really start to gain as well. If a workplace works well for returning mothers, it works well for everyone. So now I'm really delighted to introduce our guest speaker, Rachel, who is the founder and CEO of ChangeWave Consultancy. Rachel's perspective really combines strategic HR leadership with a genuine focus on inclusion, well-being, and creating workplace cultures where parents can truly thrive. Rachel, thank you so much for joining us today. I'd love to start by asking, in your experience, what actually separates organisations that genuinely embed inclusive culture change from those that stop at just awareness events like perhaps International Women's Day?
It's a great question, and again, thank you for letting me attend today. I've seen the whole gambit, I think, and I include my own personal experience. I had I don't know if it's the delight or the frightening realisation that actually it's been about 19 years since I took my first maternity leave. So I think we can call that a whole generation almost. Do you know, the sad thing is, I bet if I replayed my experience of maternity, they'd probably be very similar today, which suggests that actually in some ways we've not made much progress. We have in some areas, let's not be too pessimistic. But your question, Hannah, was, you know, what sets these organisations apart in my experience? I think you nailed it absolutely before about that human giving. This isn't about policy. Obviously, there's a basic there. There's a basic foundation. We all expect to have a policy around mat leave. I think that's just the basic starting point. How do you really test that? And it's in the moments that matter. It's in the times when you really test your organisation in terms of what they've just sold on the IWD, when they put out a lovely post on LinkedIn saying how much they supported IWD. You really test that when you're on mat leave and when you're coming back. I mean, when I think of 19 years ago, when I came back from my first maternity leave, I was locked out. I couldn't get in. I'd arranged to start a bit earlier than other people so that I could finish finish earlier than others as well, which was great, lovely. I got a great flexible working pattern. But when you can't get in the building on your first day, that's not the best start, is it? And, you know, when I just remember going back and sitting in my car, and that piece when you come back to work after a period of mat leave and you're coming back, that change in your identity, I was utterly split. I was nervous about coming to work. It might as well have been, quite frankly, my first day at work ever. That's how nervous I was. And I just left my baby at home with my husband, so I felt completely conflicted about that. And then I couldn't even get in the building, you know, and a lot of that experience is another example is we had a huge change restructure whilst I was on mat leave. How did I find out about it? Because a friend rang me up and told me about it whilst I was pushing my pram one day. You know, it's like we've disappeared off the face of the earth, and it's only for a period of 6 to 12 months, depending on what you want to do with that. That's not really a long time. It's not a long time to make somebody still feel valued in your organisation. So what I've seen really work well is when organisations are intentional. They deliberately go and that, so that whether it's IWD or whether it's, I don't know, a rainy Tuesday in November or even a rainy Tuesday in May, as we've got at the moment, you can test, if you go with that, you know, would you be locked out? Can you get your flexible working? That's what we really test our culture about, how organisations support us in the moments that matter. And where I've seen this work really well, in particular, I spent time at the Met Police. And when I say the Met Police, you might not think immediately about a really positive experience about maternity, but actually their level of support. I was lucky enough to work on a project called Met Baby, which was utterly trailblazing in my view in terms of the support we were offering at maternity. And why is that important? Because the data showed us we were losing far too many female officers at the point when they had their second child. We needed to put in some support to not just support them on mat leave, but to encourage them to come back to us afterwards. We often talk about mat leave. Let's talk about mat returners as well, so that we can, obviously there's a choice there. Not everyone will come back, but actually what we need to do is make sure everybody who wants to come back feels that we want them to come back and that they belong. So we provided a case manager for not just you as soon as you told us you were pregnant, but also your manager as well. You touched before, Francie and Hannah, on manager capability. I think sometimes we assume managers know how to deal with maternity leave, and that's not the case. And it's not the case just because you've had a baby yourself. That doesn't make a difference either, I don't think necessarily. I do think a manager, a line manager, can make or break your maternity leave in terms of the support that they give you, not just when you're off, but also about when you come back as well. So that Met Baby program was just fantastic in terms of the support it offered for both the individual who was going on mat leave, but also the manager on how to support them. And that support coaching, similar to the work that you do, Hannah, which I think is so transformational, because your point about identity is really important. And that happened all the way through, right till when you were coming back as well. So constant discussions about, not in a kind of a coercive way, but how are you preparing for coming back to work? What support do you need for us to do that? Just having those human conversations rather than waiting till they've actually dropped in and come back and then actually somebody realizes they're there, they make such a massive difference. So I've been lucky enough to work on some brilliant projects to keep in touch with people on mat leave, encourage them to come back. And what I'd ask people to think about is, look, let's face it, that was a platinum level service that we were offering at the Met. We were very lucky to get funding from the mayor, who's very supportive of things like that. But what's the one thing you could do now to support not just your women on maternity leave? We mentioned women as well. I think now this is a wider parenting issue, and that what support can you give to all working parents? So that I think again, Hannah, you said something brilliant about, because what works for people on maternity leave works for everybody. So what's the one thing you could do now to start really supporting people so that it's intentional, not just on IWD?
Absolutely. That's really great to hear, Rachel. But what was the sort of the impact of that incredible program, the Met Baby? Because obviously, like you said, there was a whole heap of support holistically, not just for the mother who was returning, but also the partners and the managers and everyone else. What was the impact of that then on retention, of engagement in the organisation?
I mean, there's so many metrics. Some of them, if I'm honest, you can't measure in terms of those metrics, but there was definite improvement in terms of those retention figures that then therefore helped the whole representation figures, because they were coming back, we weren't losing them. But I think there's wider bits. Again, Hannah, I think you mentioned about trust, loyalty. What I found with maternity returners is, you support them in those moments that matter, they will give you back double the other side. There's a real loyalty there that's built out. And often you find that and I'm not saying this is necessarily a good thing, they go above and beyond in terms of that. So I think sometimes those measures, but let's not forget that bit about manager capability as well. Some managers are very fearful of the worst thing you could say is, oh, I'm pregnant, because what do I do here now? I've not got time to deal with this. When they're very busy people, just their level of confidence is a great metric as well in terms of that capability. So across the board, there were many different measures. Some of them are a bit intangible, but you kind of know what they are, and you might not see them till another 10 years down the line, but they're worth the investment.
Yeah. Absolutely. Rachel, is there anything else from your experience that you think organisations could do or need to do to make inclusion feel real and sustainable as well? Is there anything else that you would love to see in organisations?
Oh, Hannah, where can I start? If you ask me that question, I'm going to be here for another two days even. And look, that's the work we do in particular. This isn't about one day. People get very savvy now about one day and are quite sceptical about that. Where you see it work well is where it's baked into the wider employee experience. This isn't a one-off issue. This is, quite frankly, irrelevant of what support I need, whether I'm a maternity leaver, whether I'm a working parent, whether I've got a disability and need a reasonable adjustment. Is it baked in naturally to the whole employee experience that you will help your people thrive, that they'll feel that they belong, that they've got a community? That's what really stands out, because that's the culture. And many of the organisations that we work with come to us with what they think is the issue. And actually, for example, they may come to us and say, in this situation, we need a mat leave policy. They don't need a mat leave policy. Quite frankly, you could probably pull that off at ChatGPT or something like that nowadays. I probably should be saying that. What you really need is a real deep look at your culture. How are you set up as an employee, as an organisation, to support your employees when they need you? How can you do that effectively? Because the real test of inclusion is when you've been through that major life change you were talking about, and yet you still come out the other side feeling that you belong. Because when any of us who've been on mat leave, that's a highly emotional experience. I don't know about you, there were some days when, for the first time in a long time, I genuinely didn't even know what I was doing some days. An objective for me was, have we got to the end of the day and we're all safe and in our beds? That was good. You know,
Yeah.
it really shakes your identity. You get that, Hannah? It really shakes your identity. So just having somebody to make sure that you don't need to stress and have concerns about coming back to work, and then, for example, overproving yourself. Where they deal with this is, and again, Francie, I think you touched on this point, this isn't a one-off thing. This isn't a one person issue. This is a systemic issue, and we know we have all the support needed in our organisation, whether it's whatever kind of life experience you're coming with, that we can respond to that, because we've got the policies, we've got a human approach, we've got line managers who know how to deal with compassion and care in a really effective way, so that everyone stays that they belong and that they'll stay. We can't afford to lose this talent. But having been through that whole, as my children have grown up, the amount of talent that's wasted from industry but is at the school gates because they just feel that they can't come back to work. And I think it's our responsibility to make sure they do feel they can, and that they've got the skills. Because let's face it, the other point is the skills you learn on mat leave. I think arguably you're a better employee, particularly when it comes to multitasking, than you were before you left. So for me, again, it's this bit about, this isn't about a one-off initiative. This isn't about a one-off policy. This is, how do you have a culture that supports everybody in your organisation, and that you are able to deliver what they need.
Rachel, thank you so much. I think there's been so much value in this conversation. And for me, what's really come through here is that supporting women, it's not just about the policy. It is part of it, but it's about the communication, Rachel, like you said, the confidence, the culture, and that feeling genuinely supported throughout whatever that change, whatever that transition is. If it's maternity, returners, or any kind of change, it's that genuine support that women need. Thank you so much for sharing your experience and your expertise today. That's been really wonderful. And with that, I'll hand back to Francie.
Thank you, Rachel. It just deeply resonated with me also on a personal level, especially around this identity thing, because suddenly you're just someone's mum, and like that big part of who you were before and how you kind of defined yourself as, someone working, that got lost for a while. So it has to, you really have to just find yourself again in that space. So when we were preparing this, we obviously wanted to give you some practical takeaways as well, and Rachel has already mentioned quite a few that I think, the Met Baby program, for example, I know you said that's platinum standard but great ideas already. And I'm just gonna, I'd say you touched on pretty much all of the 4 pillars already, but I'm just gonna summarize them a bit more. So the first one is intentional design. So what can HR do to build the foundations? Could there be an audit after these International Women's Day actions or activities? How does that actually impact us? What's the value of that? Aligning gender initiatives to business strategy. So it's not a standalone product, but it gains importance and relevance to everyone in the business. Building maternity and parenthood into workforce planning. So after today, for example, you could find one system or policy, and I know you said you can probably just do that with AI. So it's a quick win to review that deserves some attention in relation to this topic, and also asking yourself how you model flexibility. So how does the flexible working policy that you might already have actually translate into your day-to-day business and work? Then we've got manager enablement, and we have spoken about this already. Training managers for life stage leadership and equipping them for flexible, trust-based management. And it is so important, especially around the topic of accidental management, because people do not necessarily know enough about this topic, and they deserve training, time, and energy to enable them to support others in the best possible way. And also reducing bias around pregnancy and maternity, because there are so many studies around this topic, and it is still a thing, and maternal bias limits equity and inclusion in the workplace. So, for example, after today, if you have identified a capability gap, either in yourself or someone you work with, you could try and address this by finding some training and doing further research on the topic. And you could also challenge one assumption, either in yourself or others, after today. Then measurement and accountability. Again, Rachel said some of these things you can't necessarily measure, but you could track retention post-maternity. You could measure engagement by life stage, because tracking when and why engagement shifts is really interesting to see, and it will make it easier to find opportunities to support employees better. And tying inclusion outcomes to leadership KPIs, because you want to shift from inclusion being an initiative on the side to it being a core business driver. So you could start tracking one of these metrics to help you achieve your goal.
And the fourth one here is what we've talked about is kind of the common theme throughout all of this, which is about individual support. So what does that look like in practice? So we're talking here, sort of Rachel really talked about this with the Met Baby programme, but it's about that structured return to work support, not something informal, inconsistent, or entirely dependent on the capability of that individual manager, like Francie said, the kind of accidental manager in a lot of cases. Women need that real clear, supported transition back to work with those defined conversations, expectations, and check-in points that create across the organisation, like Rachel said, so you're not something that's forgotten about or an afterthought. The next thing is really about space for women to recalibrate their confidence and their performance expectations, because returning from maternity leave is not simply about picking up from where you left off. There's often a period of adjustment where women need to rebuild their confidence. Like we said, we sometimes completely forget what's happening and what's been going on. We're navigating that new identity. You're both mum and you're also a professional, and finding that what that sustainable rhythm between work and home life looks like to create that space for that transition, and that leads to stronger, longer term performance. There's also an unfortunate assumption that women want to slow down after maternity leave, and that's because we think that they might be now less ambitious now they're a mum. But instead of assuming that they want less responsibility or fewer opportunities, really organisations need to be opening up conversations around what success or progression and leadership can look like in this new season of their life. The opportunity here isn't about scaling women back, but to support them to succeed in a more sustainable way. Sorry, for some reason it's doing that. So after listening to everything today that we have talked about, I'd invite you to reflect on this one question. What one new practice would you like to do after today? I know that you'll have heard a whole host of ideas and suggestions, and it doesn't have to be anything huge. It doesn't have to be a big change. It could be perhaps a conversation that you want to approach differently, or an assumption you want to challenge, or kind of as Rachel or as Francie said, perhaps an audit of a policy or something in your organisation to see how effective it is and how well it and how inclusive it is. Because actually it's those smaller actions during those key transition points that have a lasting impact on engagement, loyalty and retention.
Yeah, so as a final message, we believe giving is not a concession. Supporting women through maternity transitions isn't just a nice to have, it's one of the most important moments in an employee's life cycle. And sustainable cultures are built after the spotlight fades, and it's a real opportunity to build retention and engagement with employees, which is very much what we think Give to Gain stands for. And we think International Women's Day starts the conversation, and what we do next determines whether women stay, grow and thrive. We would love to continue this conversation with you, but we have run out of time. So if you want to head to our socials or book a one-to-one with one of us if you're interested further in the topic. I also want to thank Rachel specifically for taking the time today to join us and share her expertise and experiences with us. And thank you everyone for joining. This has been recorded and we will obviously send that to you afterwards. Thank you so much.